So let's start with the definition of stress. Now, stress is not an easy thing to define for the simple reason that it is a very subjective thing. The experience of stress varies from individual to individual. What I consider as stressful need not be stressful for you, and vice versa. So what we are going to do is that we are going to start with a very basic and primitive definition of stress and then build on it to arrive at a more sophisticated and modern day definition of stress. In its simplest terms, stress is the response of the body to any change. Now, this definition comes from a very primitive and biological stage when human beings were cave dwellers and hunter-gatherers, and any change in the environment would be considered as a potential threat. And because in those days we lived in a situation where potential threats were very common, the body created itself in such a way as to be prepared to respond to threats in short notice. And this preparedness of the body was to ensure the survival of the individual in threatful situations. In modern science, this preparedness of the body is referred to as the stress response, or the survival response, or the fight or flight response. It is called a fight or flight response because on encountering a threat, the body could either fight the threat and overcome it, or if it sees the threat as something that could not be overcome, it could take to flight and escape from the threat. The neuroendocrine mechanism of the stress response is that on perceiving a threat, the amygdala of the brain, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus happens to be the autonomous command center of the brain. The hypothalamus in turn sends a signal to the pituitary gland. The pituitary happens to be the master gland of the body which controls all the other endocrine glands which secretes the hormones. On receiving the signal from the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland secretes a hormone called the ACTH, or the adrenocorticotropic hormone. The ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex, the cortical part of the adrenal gland which is situated on top of the kidneys, and the cortex of the adrenal gland, it again releases the hormone called the cortisol. In addition to this, the hypothalamus also directly stimulates the adrenal medulla, which is the inner part of the adrenal gland, again situated on top of the kidneys. In response, the adrenal medulla releases the hormones called catecholamines. The catecholamines are the adrenaline and the noradrenaline. They are also called as epinephrine and norepinephrine. These three hormones, the cortisol, adrenaline and noradrenaline, these three are primarily known as the stress hormones, and these three are responsible for the stress response. The purpose of the stress response is to hugely increase the energy metabolism of the body and to make this energy available to the neuromuscular system to respond in the form of either a fight or a flight. The manifestations of this response in the body include increased heart rate and breathing, increased muscle tone, reflexes and alertness, and also increased blood pressure and blood sugar levels. As we human beings began to evolve from a primitive stage to a more advanced stage, two important things began to happen. The cerebral cortex started to take over as the more dominant center and started to exert much more control over the environmental factors. And because of this, survival became a much more lesser threat on a day-to-day basis as it used to be. And instead of survival, we started focusing on our own well-being. And because of the shift of the emphasis from just bodily survival to overall well-being, the human being started to evolve from just a biological entity to a psycho-social and emotional entity. So based on these evolutionary changes, we will modify our definition of stress by bringing in two simple changes. Instead of considering the human entity as just a body, we now consider it as a system that is made of body, mind, emotions, and also the social context. And we also bring in the concept of well-being as applicable to all these contexts. So our new definition says that stress is a response of the human system to change and challenges to well-being. But still, this does not explain everything about stress. We need to make even further modification. The first and foremost thing is that the response to changes and challenges are not fixed responses. Take for example an individual in a new job environment, which by itself is a big change and also reasonably stressful. Now imagine on the first day itself the boss yells at this individual. The stress levels get out of control, right? Now if this happens on a daily basis, this person will come to realize that, oh, this is the nature of this fellow, and he keeps yelling. He gets inputs from his colleagues also. So slowly, steadily, his stress levels settle down to a minimum. What we mean to say is that our response to similar stressful situations can evolve over a period of time. Either it could go up or it could go down. This response, which can be learned or unlearned, we call it a dynamic response. So we modify the definition of stress a bit more and say stress is a dynamic response of the human system to change or challenges to well-being. Is that it? No, a little bit more has to be done, because my definition of well-being is going to be entirely different from your definition of well-being. For me, a modest job and an average income will be good enough to experience well-being. For another person, it could be having a top corporate job, or it could be having a lot of wealth, or it could be having the right kind of relationships with the right kind of individuals, having the right social circle, so on and so forth. And to another set of individuals, well-being would be the ability to help as many number of people as possible. So the concept of well-being is not at all fixed. It varies from individuals to individuals based on their own perceptions. So we modify our definition slightly more and say that stress is a dynamic response of the human system to change or challenges to our concepts of well-being. These challenges that we experience for our well-being are also subjective. What is challenging for me need not be challenging for you. So we add one more component to the definition and say that stress is a dynamic response of the human system to change or to perceived challenges to our concepts of well-being. Now, there is a very interesting aspect that we need to understand about the term change in the definition. Change could be either of two. It could be a welcome change or it could be an unwelcome change. Now, our concept is that welcome changes do not produce any stress. On the contrary, most commonly, welcome changes produces endless amounts of stress. For example, marriage is quite often considered as a welcome change, right? But the outcome of marriage in the long term ends up being one of the most stressful thing for many individuals. Similarly, the arrival of a new baby at home is considered as a very welcome change, but it ends up being immensely stressful for the parents in an unimaginable level. So change could be welcome change or unwelcome change, but both could end up being stressful. Now, what we need to understand is that stress is a good thing if it helps us to cope with changes and challenges. This kind of minimum levels of stress, which is actually helping us to improve our performance, is termed as eustress. But unfortunately, what has happened to modern human beings is that a mechanism that could have been helpful for us, we have turned it into a very bad habit. We started being stressful for everything and nothing. Our concepts of well-being we have made so narrow and myopic that even trivial changes and challenges ends up being extremely stressful, and it goes on in a continuous manner, and this is called distress. And when distress goes on unabated, it ends up in a number of physical and mental ailments, and at this stage it is called chronic stress. So I wish you all a very stress-free, successful life.